Is it working? Yeah? Okay. So good morning, everyone. We shall start now. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We're very glad to continue the Cosmos series of this year that we started just yesterday. And we're even more than glad to discuss this morning environmental justice together with 3 visiting scholars here at SNS. So we'll just briefly introduce them, and then we'll leave the floor to Donatella Della Porta for a keynote speech. So Margarida Esteves is the research fellow at the Center for International Studies and invited assistant professor at the Department of Political Economy in Lisbon. She's currently leading an international comparative research project on the convergence of solidarity economy and the commons in the development of alternative political economies. She's co-founder and member of the International Spokes Council of Interface, a journal for and about social movements. Her research and teaching interests include social and solidarity economy, commons, non-formal education, and qualitative research methods. Grettel Navas and Ksenija Hanaček are both researchers of the Environmental Justice Project and the Global Atlas of Environmental Justice at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology from the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. Kenya's research focuses on cultural values and environmental conflicts that arise due to extractive and industrial projects in different areas worldwide. Other current research include extractivism and environmental conflicts in the Arctic region, nuclear supply chain and environmental justice struggles in post-Soviet spaces, and coal extraction conflicts in southwestern Siberia. Grettel's current research interests are political ecology, environmental justice, environmental conflicts in the context of toxic pollution. She's also part of the direction and coordination group of the Global Environmental Justice Atlas that documents environmental conflicts and resistance movements worldwide. So I should say this is a quite unprecedented occasion for us, since we rarely have had the opportunity to discuss environmental justice within the department. It has been mostly in the last years that PhD projects have started focusing consistently on environmental matters. So this is for us an opportunity to probably start a path of research and a working group that we wish shall continue beyond the works of today. For our public and audience, we decided to divide the day in 2 different parts. So this morning, we will discuss with our guest the theoretical concept of environmental justice, what does it mean, and how communities frame this concept in their local actions. While during the afternoon, we will dive into the Environmental Justice Atlas as a research tool. This morning we are also streaming on YouTube, so people following us online can pose questions through the chat, so feel free to do so. Without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Donatella, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I think this is my last chairing of a conference or a talk as Dean of the Department, and the second one after the one yesterday in which we are again in presence, so it's very nice to be here. And I wish to thank our speakers, but also the organizers, Irina, Lorenzo, Giuseppe, and Sofia, who I think is online, that have not only accepted enthusiastically to organize this meeting, but also produced the program in a very deliberative way, and I think with a very promising structures. As Irina was saying, it is true that projects on environment and environmental social movement have been late to arrive in our department, probably also following waves of social movements. So what we saw in a faculty in which we have many PhD students working on social movements is that it is very often the attention is developed upon the different waves of protest. And so Fridays for Future was for sure important for our own research, but also for focusing attentions on of the students on this wave. But I think that also what is interesting is that, as in the case of our speakers, it is not the traditional attention to environmental groups, lobbying, and so on, but it is much more a type of research that is bridging different topics. And of course, already the definitions of climate justice points at the interactions between climate, environmental issues, and issues of justice, but also the work of Margarita, the work of our guest from the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona, and the atlas that they work upon together with Joan Martínez Alier testifies of this attention to the ways in which environmental conflicts are bridged with other types of conflicts. And also to the attention that goes to the global south and to the fact that environmentalism is not the new type of movement that is only mobilizing the middle classes, but it's a different constellation. And this is something I want to do. I've just short keynote, 15 minutes, so in order also not to take time from the rest and most important part of the program. So I was thinking to introduce this part reflecting on how environmental movements have been addressed in social movement studies, also to point at the selectivity of attention until now. New social movements have pointed at the anti-nuclear prophecy. It was the title of a book by Alain Touraine, as the type of alternative social movements that tend to substitute for the movements, labor movements of the past. There is, and so the approach was to see it as substituting for labor issues and other movements. Then there was the issues of, stressed also by Herbert Kichelt, of movements as single issues. So the environmental as sort of presenting specific characteristics of movements that were no longer addressing big ideological issues, but that were focusing on women, environment, and so on. Something that was stressed by, for instance, the work of Mario Diani, that has focused a lot upon the environmental movement, is the fact that movements in general are networks of networks, but that this is all the more true for movements that address environmental issues and that have been considered as very divided internally, so with weak ties, island in an archipelago in which several tensions tended to emerge. And I think this element of the tensions within the environmental movement is important also in terms of the ways in which it developed in time. So initially, the type of cleavage that Mario Diani observed was especially between ecologist organizations that were more looking at them within a more global perspective, and instead the specific type of organizations that tended to, in a more traditional way, address the conservation of nature. Nowadays, I think these islands are still there, but the cleavages address more the issues of the organizational structures, so the more lobbyist large groups versus the more grassroots groups. And it also tends, I think, to develop more on issues of renewable energies and to contrast lobbying for renewable energies with more global type of approaches and perspective. So in this, I'm sure our speakers will focus attention upon. The climate justice movement tend to bridge climate and social justice, but also it has been sort of important in addressing the issues of the urgencies of the intervention, so the attention to an issues that can no longer be addressed through gradual changes, but that requires immediate and radical change. And so the degrowth movement, for instance, has been quite explicit in this. Then there are global waves of protest once again, and the development of a new type of generation. So the importance that in this movement was taken by the very young. So this, I think, points also at some specificity of the environmental movements in terms of capacity to affect the general transformations. Chris Roots, who is one of the scholars in social movement studies that has more addressed the issues of environmental movement and environmental policies, has pointed at the paradox of a movement that seems to be very, very, say, effective in changing, shifting attention by the public opinion, introducing green issues in many political parties, but on the other hand seems instead to be failing in transforming the policies on the environment. So if we look at the conditions now, we see that the environmental policies of environmental protections were not at all satisfactory. I think that with the conference now, at the exit of the lockdown, what we should also reflect upon is the ways in which protesting for climate has been going on during the pandemic, but also transformed during the pandemic, and so which type of effect we can expect. And in this sense, I want to devote the last 5 minutes of my introductions to some transformations that I think have affected both the social movements in general during the pandemic and the social and the environmental movement in particular. So what do we see during the pandemic has been the unexpected resilience of social movements and their capacity to develop a type of actions on different, in different forms. So we saw movements active, trying to adapt the strategies of protest to the limitations of the lockdown. We saw the development of a new mutualism of what two of our Lorenzos call the direct social actions in the Bosi Zamponi definitions, and we see also an engagement in the development of alternative type of knowledge. And while this is a general trend, I think this has been quite important also for the environmental justice movement. This one is the first general strike on climate during the pandemic. This is in Berlin, inventing way to be present even in the most dramatic moments of the pandemic itself. But I think also the environmental movement has been relevant in inventing online forms, live stream protests, digital rallies, virtual marches, and so on, but also trying to combine or blend the online and the offline forms. And this has been the case also in the Global South, with attention to also use domestic spaces in a more political form and political way. There has been a contentious use of domestic space, balcony and so on, but also then reoccupations of the streets with car caravans, bike caravan, walks out, and so on. And I think this has been important for also the environmental justice movement, because given its constituencies, at least in the global north, it was one of the most affected by the pandemic, because it is true that it was a movement that was very much skilled in online forms of organizations and protest, but with the schools and the universities closed, those spaces for encounters were closed as well. So it was one of these movements that suffered quite a lot from being pushed online, even if this didn't mean that they stopped their forms of participation. Many movements, and I think in the environmental justice movement this was particularly important with new forms of consumptions, initiatives connected with food sovereignty and so on, social movement organizations and also activists in a very grassroots way in the pandemics also tended to address the immediate needs of the constituencies. So what we saw in an initial research on this moment is that also for the environmental justice movement, the perspective for enlarging, broadening the type of social basis, the type of consumers, also acted in terms of producing different types of innovations, and in terms of framing and in terms of organization. So it was very grassroots, and we saw it from Florence to Trento to other cities, this capacity to organize. Also networked through the use of digital media, and also with the attempt to network at the same times cooperatives of consumptions and cooperative of productions, building upon a trend that had already developed, but also that started to be more important now. And then it was a movement that was very much politicized. So while developing at the grassroots and in a very pragmatic way, it tended also then to develop a political discourse that is there to stay. Also, what was interesting with the pandemic was that the networking went beyond the traditional basis of the specific movements, bringing together activists at the grassroots, coming also from different movements and perspective. And I think that this increasing relevance of the local but networked locals is something that we saw also in movements of protest immediately after the lockdown, like the Black Lives Matter, and that seems to be also framed as a general attempt to reconstitute the importance of the territory in a moment in which it seems that the territory was virtual, but that also spread the perceptions that you needed to reconquer this type of spaces. And this, in fact, I think was important also for the climate justice movements in a focus on creating alternative type of knowledge, which is an aspect of social movements, organizations, activities, and activists that we rarely study, with the exception of Anna Margarita, that worked on the issues. So the production, the sharing, the distributions of knowledge was particularly important in this moment, because it also helped connecting different movements in building upon the general acknowledgement of the linkages between the different crises, and putting together also activists that were active on different crises. And I think this type of building of alternative knowledge could be addressed with different concepts. The type of activities that I saw going on in the global justice movement during and after the pandemic were related with sort of whistleblowing activities of denouncing specific types of problems and connections with specific type of grievances, but also the development of alternative public spheres to debate how to change situations that proved to be very challenging. And also in the global south, the spreading of information about the pandemic and about how safe direct production could be useful to address not only issues of global justice, but also of immediate security has also been important. And so a sort of pedagogy, especially in context in which the government's alternated moment of negationist politics, rejecting the existence of the pandemic with very authoritarian moves, like in India, for instance. So I think this is something that is worth investigating also later on the different conflicts, and the Atlas will be a very fundamental, important instrument for this. So also the bridging of issues of public health, social inequalities, environmental challenges, and so on. So I finish here with my general, concerns in the last periods of my research on social movements, that is trying to see which specificities social movements have in times of crisis. And the pandemic is one of these times. And it is a moment in which the protest tend to develop as eventful, as producing changes, producing sudden ruptures, but also to be, transferred from one context to the next, and to stabilize the legacy of the rupture in times. To which extent the pandemic creates opportunities for these transformations, especially in terms of what social movement studies define as the disruptive effect of everyday life that crises have, and the opening of discursive opportunities for change. But at the same time, react to challenges like the extreme increase in inequalities, the top-down types of interventions, emergency powers, and so on, I think is an open issue. But these transformations can have important effect also on the climate justice movement. So, thank you to all.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see all of you here. Donatella, thank you so much for your introductory speech, your keynote speech. What I'm bringing you today is the presentation of preliminary results of how transnational networks for regenerative development approach the topics of environmental justice in the context of grassroots mobilization and community action. In order to delve into this topic, first of all, we need to define just transitions, environmental justice. What do we talk about when we talk about environmental justice and just transitions? These are that kind of buzzwords that we tend to use so often that sometimes the more we use it, the more we forget about its original meaning. And it ends up being emptied of meaning and used sometimes in a way as a cliche, like Che Guevara t-shirts. According to the International Labour Organization, just transition needs to contribute to the goals of decent work for all, social inclusion, and the eradication of poverty. The source of this concept is the labor movement. It's a class-based concept rooted in a dialectic materialist worldview and in a political economy approach. And the original goal of this concept was to protect and equip workers whose jobs, livelihoods, and communities were being put at risk, not only by climate change itself, but also by climate interventions aimed at promoting more sustainable economies based on a post-carbon framework. And the concept of just transitions and also the policy strategies it inspired aimed to address environmental discrimination based on race and the colonial legacy. As a response, for example, to the race discrimination protests that happened in 1982 in Warren County in North Carolina in the United States. These protests were one of the foundational moments of what came to be understood as the just transition framework. But the way in which this concept was further developed aimed to solidify the connection between three pillars of sustainable development: social justice, the environment, and the economy, and providing a connective tissue between the different sustainable development goals. A connective tissue that, I must say, is still quite dim, quite thin, and quite fragile, and that can be easily torn. 2 years ago, the OECD published a document, a report about the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which showed very clearly, based on very solid data that while the ecologically oriented sustainable development goals were being well taken care of by national level public policies in many places of the world, the social justice oriented sustainable development goals were being relegated to second or third place in what regards priorities, policy priorities. A situation which puts the very implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals strategy in jeopardy, because in order to be truly successful, it has to be considered in a holistic way and has to be integrated systemically. It's not possible to have a sustainable transition without social and environmental justice. And what we talk about when we talk about regenerative development, the term regenerative development is still not as much as a buzzword as environmental justice or just transitions, but it's becoming more and more used in the social movement milieu, and also in the policy-making field. An approach to development, or as my colleague Thomas Henfrey says, post-development, that treats natural and human processes as inherently linked. One cannot be properly understood without the other. Nature and culture are intrinsically linked, are synergetically linked. The purpose of this approach is to arrest and reverse both ecological degradation and also the loss of community, meaning the loss of the cultural skills that are necessary for living in harmony with local environments, meaning not only other species, but among humans themselves. The purpose is to try to reverse, or better, or to rediscover the meaning of community and collective action beyond the increased individualization that was promoted in the post-Fordist period. Therefore, at the core of the regenerative development approach, or post-development approach, this is still a concept in construction, in emergence, and therefore it's being constantly contested, deconstructed, and reconstructed. And this process of reconstruction is at the core of my current research project. At the core of this approach is the promotion of community-led initiatives as a strategy for rebuilding the fabric of social life, as well as ecosystems, from the destructive impact of market pressures. And from research, if we look at community-led initiatives from a diachronic perspective, we can easily find two moments in which they have proliferated like mushrooms. They have proliferated actually in a period of retreat of waves of protest, of waning of two waves of protest. One of them was the aftermath of the protest waves of the 60s and 70s, and the neoliberal period that happened, that ensued in the late 70s with the consequent retreat of the state. And the other moment was that of the two first decades of this century, especially in the late 2000s and early 2000 and the early 2010, the early years of the last decade, in which community-led initiatives proliferated, not only as a response, as a constructive response to the externalities of neoliberal globalization, which decreased the ability and disposition of the state to mediate new claims, not only for the expansion of rights and redistribution of public goods, but also for the containment of corporate influence in policymaking, especially in what regards environmental topics. In this sense, we can consider that networks like the Global Eco-Village Network, the Transition Town Network, and RIPES, the transnational platform for social and solidarity economy can be considered social movements. If we frame and if we define social movements in a broad way. In fact, if we take Scott and Gordon's definition of social movements as politics by other means, and as a loosely organized effort by a large group of people or organizations, or as a group action that involves individuals, organizations, or both, with the purpose of changing the status quo, we can very well envision these transnational organizations, these transnational civil society organizations, as international social movement organizations. And we can also envision the community-led initiatives that I'm talking about today, namely eco-villages, transition towns, and solidarity economy initiatives like alternative markets, community development banks, local currencies, and workers and producer cooperatives like Mondeggi, very close to Florence, which I had the joy of visiting some weeks ago. We can consider them as what our colleagues Lorenzo Bozzi and Lorenzo Zamponi call direct social actions. They're economic organizations that, following the ideas of also our colleague Mario Piana, are divided between two logics. On the one hand, the logic of the market. They need to create value in order to sustain themselves, to survive and to thrive. Also with the purpose of promoting a logic of contention. They can be considered as a kind of container of a container of energy of contention, of potential for protest, or social and hopefully social transformation. In my two latest articles, I called the spaces that are created by these community-led initiatives mobilizational commons. Spaces that are constructed and managed collectively with the purpose of being spaces of mobilization, very often spaces of protest, like the project Esperança com Esperança in southern Brazil, which is a market and also a space openly created for political mobilization and a very visible form of political mobilization, and also protest. Their market in the town of Santa Maria in Rio Grande do Sul is a starting point of many marches and protest activities that happen in the city. And therefore, they can be understood as spaces of incubation of subaltern public spheres. And in these fields, in the field of regenerative development or post-development, we can identify two master frames. One of them can be defined as holistic, which is based on the application of whole systems design frameworks, inspired by what my colleague Thomas Henfrey, based on other authors, calls pattern language, patterns of interspecies cooperations observed in ecosystems. And this pattern language is the base of permaculture and bioregionalism, for example, which is applied in the development of eco-villages and transition town projects. And the other master framework is what I call dialectic, based on political economy, based on a materialist framework, either Marxist or post-Marxist, which frames structural transformation through political means as a condition for regenerative development. In this dialectic master framework includes narratives like degrowth and social ecology, and this is the basis of the solidarity economy movement and of transnational social movement organizations like REPAS. Okay, what are eco-villages? I'm sure many of you have heard of eco-villages, or most of you, and that you might have visited some. This concept, which is based on what I call a holistic master narrative, emerged in northwestern Europe in the late 70s in a middle-class countercultural milieu as a response to the growing sense of breakdown of community and the burgeoning data on environmental degradation and its social consequences. It developed as a response to post-materialists concerns. And eco-villages are prefigurative community-based settlements that aim to teach by example, that aim to serve as educational models and living laboratories of sustainability. They aim to build, support, and develop a social movement as centers for the reproduction of frames through educational activities, paid, and very handsomely paid, in most of the times, I must say, and in which people learn how to build community among other humans and other species through forms of governance aimed at supporting the development through everyday praxis of collaborative capabilities such as trust and cooperation, participatory decision-making, and the non-violence resolution of conflicts. The most significant international social movement organization is the Global Eco-Village Network, which was created at a conference at the Findhorn Eco-Village in Scotland in 1995. And this conference was the culmination of 5 years of participatory action research funded by Gaia Foundation based in Denmark, which aimed to research and to create a model of transformative community of sustainable human settlement based on already existing community-led initiatives. Within the holistic frame, we also have the Transition Network, which is based in very similar narratives than the Global Eco-Village Network. Actually, the activists who started this network in 2007 began their activist trajectory within the Eco-Village movement. And they decided to create the Transition Town Network as a framework to transfer the frames and the skills that were developed within the Eco-Village Network to an urban and peri-urban environment in order to make it more flexible and also more inclusive, with the focus of promoting self-sufficiency communities aimed at reducing the potential effects of peak oil, climate destruction, and economic instability. So this organization, the Transition Network, was founded in 2007 in the United Kingdom, in the town of Totnes, by Rob Hoskins, Ben Brangwyn, and another gentleman. All right now, but there were 3 friends who started their activist trajectory by creating an eco-village in Ireland. They faced a lot of discrimination, even harassment by surrounding villages, because they saw their presence as a kind of encroachment of a kind of urban middle-class, lifestyle and worldview that didn't fit with local traditions. The dialogue was very difficult. So they tried to recreate the frames of the movement within a wider framework and with a much more, within a much more porous environment. I can tell you more about this during the Q&A session. Okay, solidarity economy. As you might have already perceived, the solidarity economy master frame and narrative, the solidarity economy narrative, which is very much rooted in the dialectic master frame, has a class and identity approach to the development of community-led initiatives and to the promotion of sustainability transitions. Core purpose is to redefine the economic space by upscaling and giving visibility and institutional and political recognition to non-capitalist forms of work and organization developed within marginalized communities and also social groups which are not central to capitalism and which are pushed to the markets by the dynamics of capitalism. And the local and regional movements that are part of this organization are organizing community-based economic projects in webs of mutual recognition and support with the purpose of building a democratic alternative to the economic orthodoxy, democratizing the economy And with this purpose in mind, democratizing the state and decentralizing politics is very much at the core of the strategic frames of RIPES and its associated networks and organizations. Okay, what are the approaches to environmental justice of these organizations? The very first one to openly address this topic was the Transition Network. This happened in March 2010. There were a series of workshops on diversity and inclusion within the movement. Many activists of the movement started to realize that, hey, we look around us and we see mainly white faces, people with a middle or upper middle class background and what Pierre Bourdieu would call a habitus, and most of them are white. Although our society is becoming increasingly more diverse and more polarized and more unequal. The purpose of this movement is to promote social justice and inclusion. Why was it not happening within the movement itself? So, in a little bit over 10 years ago, the Transition Network went through a period of internal research, soul searching, and so on, and it developed a series of strategies aimed at openly addressing invisible and unspoken and unacknowledged barriers to participation within the movement. And it developed a series of strategies aimed at promoting, mainly dialogical strategies, communication strategies, aimed at making, disparities in power and injustices transparent, in order to be able to better include people in the movement that do not fit the demographic profile of the founders and of the core activists. If this is going to work, let's hope so, but it will take time until we can actually assess the results. This exploration of rank and privilege and how it works within the movement, that has been kind of developing a little bit at the margins of public policy, based on based on resources that come mainly from philanthropy and from the private sphere. That's the basis of the resource mobilization strategy. The Global Eco-Village Network is now dealing with the very same topic. Since 2018, there have been a series of seminars addressing privilege, rank, inequalities, and microaggressions within the movement. This is the initiative of members and collaborators from the Global South. And if you don't mind that I engage in a little bit of a shameless self-promotion, I can say that I was invited by a South African activist of the Global Eco-Village Network to be a keynote speaker in one of these seminars that happened last year, in which we addressed this question of privilege, rank, and inequality in the communication among activists and actually in the everyday praxis of eco-villages. RIPES, although RIPES has been having this, these topics of rank, privilege, and inequality at the core of its frames, it has recently acknowledged that it's still not immune to the reproduction of the very same inequalities that it wants to avoid. Right now, RIPES is in a process of understanding why is it that the core activists of the movement are white men with a university background, most of them either from the Global North or from a middle-class background of the Global South. And it's trying to understand the material and also symbolic dynamics that deal to to this, to this ranking and exclusionary process. Good to see that these networks are actively addressing topics of justice within their own everyday praxis. And it's good that they're looking at themselves in order to be able to better address these topics in wider society, in order to be the change that they want to see in the world. Now the big question is how to connect this internal practice of reflection and of dialogue and of dismantling the reproduction of inequalities with a wider practice of challenging the structural power relations and changing the status quo. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It was a little bit difficult.
Yeah.
So that's why I might have.
No, absolutely. It was very clear and so insightful. And
Thank you.
I think there are plenty of points of connection with our researches that we might discuss in the afternoon. Mm-hmm. So I leave the floor right away to Grettel Navas. Yes.
Okay.
Well, thank you. I would like to start, by thanking for inviting us, for being here today in this beautiful building and city. We are very happy to share today with you the work we have been doing in Barcelona under the Environmental Justice Project, but also all the work that we have been carrying out now more than 8 years now with the Environmental Justice Atlas, and how we are doing research with this tool beyond the common study of a case study. With the Atlas, what we want to do with the Atlas is to see the global trends. So it's another methodology that it has been defined as comparative or statistical political ecology. So basically, this is what we are going to share today. It's some of the research is some findings that, in my case, it was from my PhD thesis, and Ksenija will also share her work as a postdoctoral researcher. So I divided my presentation as follows. First, what is, mostly the question you sent to us, what is environmental justice as a theoretical concept? And how do local communities frame environmental justice in my research? Or how do I also use other theoretical tools to frame environmental conflicts, and in particular environmental health conflicts? In my thesis, I was most concerned about what does mean to protest in the context of toxic pollution, all the complexities that toxic pollution has. How do people react under these specific conflicts? And then a concluding discussion that I hope would lead us to more questions and more debate afterwards. So environmental justice as a theoretical concept. I will talk more about the foundations of environmental justice. What does it mean? So basically, as already Ana Margarita said, no, is to take equity and social justice in every environmental decision. Basically, it can be like broadly framed as that. But it also, its aim is to explore the relationship between socio-demographic difference, such as race, class, gender, but not only, also the intersection of this social demographic difference, no? And also beyond, I mean, the distribution of environmental benefits and burners. What do I mean with that? What could be a benefit mean? It's, for instance, if there is like a mining project in, I don't know, Guatemala, who will take the economic benefits of this project and who will pay the cost, for instance, the contamination of the pollution of the river. So basically, as it was founded, it was more this distributional aspect of environmental justice. And later also some scholars have gone beyond this distributional aspect and to take matters also of participation, which means like who is taking part of the environmental decision, no? Who is invited to the table to decide how will be like an environmental decision in a specific community, and also whose values are recognized. So these are like three main, there is the David Schultzberg triangle, no, of distribution, participation, and recognition. And there are much more debate in this regard, but basically these are like the three main concepts of the foundations of the field. As already Ana Margarita said, it originated in the USA as a response of environmental racism, which I think it's also a very important concept, no, in the antecedents of environmental justice. And in fact, yes, it started, or as I want to say that it started as a field of research. It doesn't mean that it was the first time that environmental justice, injustice of environmental racism was already there. But at least this case could be like one of the foundations of the environmental justice as a field of research. And this was in 1982, exactly, when Black communities were protesting against the establishment of a toxic landfill with PCB, which is, I will repeat the name, but it's polycrylbrimo or something like that. You can look for it. A very toxic material that the most important of this, it was very persistent in the environment. Actually, up to now, communities in warring counties have acknowledged that the PCB remains there and possibly will remain there for more, I don't know how many more years. So, yes, with this case, what scholars, specifically Robert Bullard and other scholars have found that health risk and environmental hazards were not placed randomly, but there was a target, but they were placed like with an intention to place these toxic landfills, in particular these cases, no, in where the racialized communities live. So this is like also like a place-based analysis of how environmental justice, no? There is also some debates of if, for instance, if the hazards comes to the communities that are that live already there, or if these communities are pushed to the places of where these spaces are, as we will see with Ksenia's research, no? So some of the debates now are, of course, beyond race and class, which were the first concepts, but now we see that there's also many others, like social demographic concept, like particularly gender. But what is more important now is like all the critical environmental justice mostly talk about the intersection of these socio-demographic. So as I said, here, no, the EPA chose this county for a toxic dump because its residents were few, Black, and poor. So a case to remember. So beyond this case, this is the case, the entry in the IJATLAS, the case of Warren County. But what we want to do, of course, is another methodology. It can lose some in deep details as the case study could be. But what the ICTA wants to show is that there is not only a case study, but it's a systematic process, not only in the US, but around the world. No? So which are these differences, which are these economic activities? This is exactly what we are trying to understand better and to do more research using the ICTA. I will not deep into the ICTA now. We have this special session in the afternoon. But here I want to say that each point, it's an environmental conflict, and each color represents one of the 10 different economic activities that we have in the map. For instance, mining conflicts are with the orange color, or nuclear conflicts are yellow, and so on. So we will show the ICTA as a tool in the afternoon. So just to say that the Environmental Justice Atlas is the largest global sample available on environmental conflicts today. And we are using it to do studies on statistical political ecology, was what I already said. It's go beyond the case study to identify regional and global patterns of environmental justice worldwide. And actually, we came here also because you are a group studying social movements. No? So one of the questions that we would like to discuss more is that if we could frame the global environmental justice as a social movement. So I think this question, we can keep it for the afternoon, how could be defined, or if there are many movements, or which are the difference. So basically, this is why we would like to strengthen more the collaboration with you and your group. Because as you said in the morning, I mean, there is you are starting to study environmental justice, but we are also deeping more in the social movements theory. So I think it's very timely collaboration. So how I was studying, or how is environmental justice framing my research? What I did, and this is the third chapter of my PhD thesis, was I wanted to understand how and why do environmental conflicts that reported health impacts linked to toxic pollution were differing from other types of conflicts in the ICTA. So what I did, it was to use the whole database, 3,033 conflicts at that time, and to divide the conflicts that were reporting health impacts, mostly physical health impact, and with those that do not. I think there are very, main findings, some interesting findings, some of them not very surprising, such as this one, which is the higher proportion of environmental conflicts are mostly linked with industrial activities, waste management, and nuclear conflicts, and less in tourism and infrastructure. So, of course, we are known that industrial activities use a lot of toxic materials and persistent toxic materials. So this is one of the characterizations of the conflicts that I am studying. And what is interesting now, and I want to explain also the graphic with a case study. This is a case in Chile, in Quintero Puchuncaví, where it has been framed as a sacrifice zone, but not by the grassroots organization, even by the government. The government said someone needs to be sacrificed to extract these materials and to do economic growth. So you can look at an internet, the president said this is a sacrifice zone, no? But also in sacrifice zones, they live sacrificed bodies and people live in there. So this case is very interesting because as you can see in the map, there are many activities, there is Codelco, which is the copper mining, there is also other industrial. So for people, what is interesting here is that for them it's very difficult to target one specific company because it's so that complex, so many toxic materials around the water, the soil, the air, that for them, what are they protesting for? They are protesting pollution, but at the time in doing the social mobilization and to do this kind of protests, it's hard to identify, no? It's protesting against what, against whom, no? So there is a specific characterization of this environmental health conflict that I see, that is the highly complex and the need, of course, of the scientific evidence, no, to start asking for political action. And this scientific evidence, of course, is not easy to do it. You need time, you need resources for them to say, for instance, yes, this is the toxic chemical that is making cancer in the specific community. So as you see also, here is the school. So there is a high concentration in this part of the country, high rates of cancer compared to the rest of the country, and of course, children and vulnerable communities are much more affected. Another interesting findings is when do people mobilize? In the EU Atlas, we have this variable to identify where if people mobilize before, when the project is planned, when the project is being built, or after. I see that in environmental health conflicts, they predominate when social responses organize around for reparation. This means when the damage is already there, when everything is already polluted, and less prevalent, yes, in preventive phases, which is a very interesting point, but as some colleagues have already shown, when the mobilization starts in preventive phases, there are much more chance to stop the project and then to succeed. So this is interesting, as people do not protest in preventive phases, but mostly when the damage is already there. And here I wanted to draw on this graph with the Minamata disease. I don't know if you know the case in Japan, where for more than 30 years, a company was throwing methyl mercury, which is a toxic chemical, in the river, and the fisher people were fishing and eating the fish that was contaminated. So they only realized that after so many years, people start to have the disease, which is being called the Minamata disease, which is morely an affection in the nervous system, no? So this case draw a lot on how the delayed effects of toxic pollution can affect local communities to ability to act preventively. And this, as you know, it's a process of slow violence, no? Normally in environmental conflicts, the violence is being framed like some more direct violence, such as the murder of environmental defender or the criminalization of environmental defender. But what I see with these cases is that it's not that kind of direct violence, but it's more a process of slow violence, that it's dispersed across time, across space, and that is often not even visible for the people who is suffering the slow violence. So one of the questions research that rise from here is how to make this slow violence visible in the preventive phases, no? Before the damage is already there and before it cannot be repaired, no? But you can tell me how you can repair when everybody is already ill, for instance, or the soil is contaminated. So what I bring more into the debate in my dissertation was environmental justice across time and space, using this idea of Nixon's slow violence concept, and to leap from this environmental justice based analysis to a more understanding of the environmental justice. Yes, I'm going to repeat it myself, but across time and space, because as toxic chemicals, no? For instance, the pesticides travel through the soil, to the water, to the air, affecting the health of communities living miles away. So if you are living nearby, I don't know, a banana plantation in the south where the toxic chemical is being there, this means that not only the communities or the workers that are working there have been affected, but also much more communities. So I think that environmental justice in the context of toxic pollution poses this also these other questions, no? How should it be framed? And then there is also the transnational relocation of hazards, and this it's very linked to global north-south relations, no? Sometimes some pesticides that are banned in the north, they are used in the south. So this poses also about how the role of governments in this transnational relocation of environmental, on transnational relocation of hazards, and what does environmental justice mean at a global level, no? And then, as I said, there is also the key role of the scientific evidence, high rates of uncertainty in these environmental conflicts, particularly because communities, sometimes it's very hard for them to get the scientific evidence to claim political action. Then there is a key role of the body in this protest. This is an image, a painting of Fabian Tomasi, who is he already dead. He's a victim of glyphosate in Argentina. And when they used to go to the protest, he used to say, I don't need to protest. My body is my denouns. So you only look at me and you see that there is an environmental justice there. So there is very interesting theoretical theoretical lines of research on feminist Latin American political ecologies, no, that says that how the body epitomizes or how the body represents the landscape, the toxic landscape that you live, no. So what I saw in these environmental conflicts is that beyond mobilizations or other actions, other like repertories of contentions, how they are used, of course, public protest, other forms of protest, but then the body, it's also like the key tool of protest, as Fabian Tomasi used to say. So I think this also gives a broader analysis, no, what the materiality of the body representing a story, but also a geography of pollution. And of course, there is also an intergenerational aspect, as I said, no? Not only because toxic chemicals remain in the landscape for many years, affecting more than one generation, but also how these chemicals are also inherent through bodies. We have seen cases, for instance, with breast milk feeding, no? DDT, how was transfer to the newborns, but also, as many cases in China, and lead exposure in placenta. So there is this in utero and postnatal exposure, no? How we could think this as an environmental, intergenerational environmental injustice, no? So this is another aspect, that one of the findings of this research. And then, who mobilizes in these conflicts? And this was very, this was a little bit surprising, because the Environmental Justice Atlas, as Donatella said in her talk, has been mostly, or the cases we are studying with Joan Martinez-Salier with the theory of the environmentalism of the poor, they are mostly like indigenous people protesting, and it's not like a post-material demand. It's because they are protesting because they live and they depend on this, their livelihoods depends on the nature they are defending. No, so here what the cases, the environmental health cases told us is that many of these that there is a higher proportion of working class communities protesting in these cases. So as you see in the graph, there's mostly industrial workers, waste picker, informal workers, artisanal miners that are much more represented when the health impacts are reported in the database, no? So this gives you to another debate, which is that there is not this kind of job versus environment paradox, no? So mostly what the cases said to us is that there is a pattern of working class environmentalism in the Atlas, specifically in these cases, that the working communities are those who mobilize in higher rates. So what I am trying to understand now, and which are these networks between the working class and the communities, the local communities who mobilize, how do they do it, and so on. So just to wrap up, environmental justice, across time, the need to deep more into this, the intergenerational environmental justice, as I said before, and how to define environmental justice when there is this persistent pollution and forever chemicals, there is not only one generation or one specific space, but it goes across this specific characteristic and not time and space. The need to understand more as a global debate on the toxic pollution across geographies and how the hazards are being also traveled, but they don't travel because of natural travel as it happened, that some chemicals travel to the river. I am saying here that they travel because governments systematically decide to put hazards in other countries, and most often from the north to the south. This is the case, for instance, of asbestos. There is a very well-known case of asbestos contamination in Cerdañola del Vallès, around our university, when Spain banned asbestos in Cerdañola. In Spain, the same company, and I am saying the same company, started to extract and produce asbestos in Colombia. So, then this is the key question of environmental justice, who gets what and why. If asbestos is contaminating the people in Cerdañola, who will tell you that it will not do it also in Colombia? So this kind of basic questions, I think, allow us to understand more environmental justice in a global dimension. And then, the human body, of course, as a site of social and environmental struggle. And finally, yes, a pattern of working class environmentalism in conflicts where health is being reported as a big impact in the database. So yes, this is all from my side. Thank you very much. Here is my email and also the ICTA database that we are going to discuss more in the afternoon.
Thank you very much, Grettel. So I guess we'll take advantage of this perfect timing and definitely bridge social movements and environmental justice coalitions. So I leave the floor to Ksenija Hanaček.
Much for organizing this event, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share my research with you. So with this presentation, I'm trying to answer the question, what is environmental justice and how do local communities frame or claim environmental justice? And I will be looking into 3 different regions and 3 different topics to address these questions. So the first one is the Arctic as a commodity frontier. The second one is nuclear supply chain in post-Soviet spaces. And the third one is here in Europe and Romani environmental justice claim. So in our recent publication, we started to see that the Arctic is becoming commodity extraction frontier, and there is an evidence of increasing environmental conflicts in the region. So just a background, we found diamond mines placed on First Nation territories in Arctic Canada, but besides only being mine placed there, it's also that after one project, another one is taking place. Now, the proposal is to dump the mine waste into indigenous lands and waters. The second example is a coal mine in Taimyr Peninsula in Arctic Russia, which, according to local activists, is illegal because it doesn't have a permit, and it's mainly used for export coal to India, and is thereby putting one of the world's biggest natural reserve in the Arctic under threat. So in total, we found 53 environmental conflicts in the Arctic region, and this geography, as we can see, overlaps predominantly with indigenous peoples' territories. And the conflicts are characterized mostly by visible mobilizations, but we also find high-intensity conflicts with repressive reactions, with violence taking place against individuals or groups protesting. So we see here this dimension of projects, one after the other, and the dimension of commodities that have been extracted on these lands, such as crude oil, and electricity, and natural gas, coal, including uranium, nickel, rare earth materials, and also diamonds. So this is the dimension of these conflicts that we have been looking into. In terms of social resistance or social movement, we found that there is a transversal network between groups in the Arctic, as we can see on the network on the right side of the slide, and how they collectively connect and make a transversal network and fighting against these projects on their lands. And they include local grassroots organizations and indigenous groups, and also sometimes local scientists and local governments and political parties. We also look at 3 variables that can be explored in the EJ Atlas, which is looking into repression in the resistance process, also social environmental consequences at stake, what is that people are claiming there, and who is claiming, and what makes a difference for a project cancellation in this case. So we explored these variables, and we saw that it's repression against activists and people is much more likely in absence of preventive resistance, as Grettel mentioned earlier, but also structural patterns such as rule of law in countries such as the United States and Russian Federation. We also saw that there is a high impact on loss on traditional knowledge and practices and human-nature relationship that indigenous peoples hold and protect in the Arctic region, including the consequences of climate change, and which are higher on their territories, because these territories are high, full of biocultural values sustained for millennia. And the chances to achieve the cancellation of project is also higher if dependency on natural resource rents, such as oil, coal, and gas, is low in the country. So a discussion on this research, we argue that the Arctic has been used to expand these commodity frontiers that are needed in our for our, let's say, sustaining the economies, especially for metals and fossil fuels. And this clear-cut distinction from north to south does apply, but in this sense of Arctic, we also see that in both peripheral regions, in the north and the south, people and their traditional territories have been targeted by extractive capital. And we also reflect on imposed colonial relations through extractive projects in the Arctic, and which are interrelated with different forms of repression from both state and corporate hybrids. And we argue that these projects, even so, operate on thin ice, as their social environmental impacts are far-reaching. There is also resistance against these projects that are mounting. So We move now to the research on nuclear supply chain and environmental justice struggles in post-Soviet spaces. There was a Nevada Semipalatinsk anti-nuclear movement active from 1989 to 1991 in Kazakhstan. And the movement was crucial, we found, for putting an end to nuclear tests in the Semipalatinsk, and also helped to achieve a moratoria to nuclear tests in the Soviet Union, but also beyond. And we also found a case in Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic Russia, which was, back then it was indigenous land, and Nenets, indigenous people, were resettled from their lands, and still today Novaya Zemlya remains a highly militarized space. And over the course of 40 years, 132 nuclear explosions took place in the area, poisoning indigenous lands, seas, and waters. And also we found in post-Soviet spaces that there is a lot of issues related to uranium mining, but also the waste in insecure sites. And in the town of Toboshar, we find 12 million tons and 300-meter high radioactive waste placed in next to communities, and with high health consequences. And that communities are protesting against it. So with this paper, we looked in how injustices are manifested across commodity life chain, in this case nuclear, which for us was important for developing stronger comparative methodologies that recognize and connect up different framings of what environmental justice is within nuclear supply chain when we look to uranium extraction, nuclear power plants, and nuclear energy production, nuclear tests, and also waste disposals. And looking at the 14 cases, we found that seven have been suspended by neighbors, citizens, and communities, but also women, industrial workers, as Grettel was mentioned, know the dimension of the impact of nuclear issues on industrial workers and also indigenous groups. We also found, however, that the projects somehow remain, or they do remain, on ongoing concern as long as they are related to nuclear waste, either from Soviet times or present time, and also potential nuclear accidents. So the course of environmental conflict continues. Also does the worry about health and other environmental justice issues. No? And what was very specific for these cases was also military violence that is instinct to nuclear power domination, but which encounters anti-nuclear resistance in areas where environmental nuclear injustices and legacies are lived today still. And so we call nuclear supply chain as active or radioactive legacies that seek social and environmental justice for about 8 decades now. And thereby the movement is revealing the past and present nuclear supply chain issue. So these are processes also of what has been called nuclear peripheralization, but not only in terms of space, but also political, military, and economic powers, and also impact on health in the nuclear supply chain, as well as histories of marginalized groups and their anti-nuclear struggles. Because periphery has all these issues, but periphery also has a resistance. And the third work in progress that we address environmental justice in Europe and in general, and with this presentation in Central and Southeastern Europe, in general is Romani environmental justice that was a collective work, and the background of this research was carried out by EEB, European Roma Grassroots Organization, and ourselves in the EJ Atlas. And we found at least 32, let's say, environmental justice issues related or imposed to Romani people in Europe. And we look on how these environmental issues, how does environmental racism is imposed to Romani people, and what have been they claiming and saying us that is happening. We found that the central factor by looking at these 32 cases leading to environmental justice issue and health issues are forced evictions. It starts with forced eviction by the state authorities, and we wanted to see what is happening from there and how environmental issues are reflected in forced evictions, no? And one of the cases that we found and that we address is that the UN resettled 600 Romani people and children to a mining and smelting complex, exposing them to lead poisoning for over 20 years. It was Romani people from Kosovo in the middle of the Kosovo conflict, so with refugees status. So people are displaced to industrial mines and with polluted land and air, and they suffer accidents and deaths very often. And what we saw in this paper was that not only the industry is targeting Romani spaces, it's that physically people have been placed to very harmful environmental settings. And what happened once people are evicted there is also pattern of monitoring water sources for Romani people, and also cutting off these public water wells, which sometimes is the only available water source for the people if it's not polluted. And we also found by looking at and analyzing the cases that there is in this process of mobilization and then authorities giving explanation why these decisions have been made, there is also a green discourse behind these decisions, and that serve as justification for forced evictions that lead to highly damaging environmental and health settings. This is what we found as well. And in general, to close, so there are many and multiple ways in which environmental racism is manifested against Romani people in Europe. And we also try to look into historical internal colonialism and racialization of Romani people within Europe, that today are interrelated with these eviction processes, through which contamination, toxic environments, and death of Romani people are taking place. And we argue that these relations sustain long-lasting racialization and othering through state power and white domination in environmental discourses, settings, and decision-makings. And despite these profound forms of oppression, there is a resistance, and people are making visible this harmful environmental racism manifestation and oppose existing relations of racial, patriarchal, and class domination that control subaltern groups. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ksenija. So we're finished with the presentations from our speakers. We'll take a very short break. We said 10 minutes, we agreed. So let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll reconvene here then at 11:55 sharp with the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay. It should be working. No, why it does this. There's a bit of sound, but maybe it's normal. Okay. Here, yeah, better. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for all the very rich and insightful presentations. Now it's the time for a Q&A, and we're going to accept questions from the YouTube audience. So I really much encourage people who are following us on YouTube to write their questions on the chat, and I will read them out loud. And also questions coming from the audience here in presence. So I'll start with a question that was posed by Sofia, who's helping us organizing and who's following us online. And she asked a question for everyone. That is, environmental racism and injustice can occur because of the indifference of those of us who benefit, mainly us in the middle class in the global north. How do you think we can mobilize more people to not accept environmental injustice that we benefit from? And yes, and then there is a similar question specifically for Anna, that is, prefigurative environmental movements led by BIPOC communities all over the world have existed for a long time and still exist, and especially poor peasant communities. Why do you think mainstream environmental movements tend to skew middle class and white in the global north? And let's see if there are other questions on YouTube. Not yet, so maybe we can collect another couple of questions from the audience here. Donatella?
I enjoyed very much all three presentations. And they made me thinking about two issues in particular. One is the territorial dimension, which I had not mentioned as one of the ways in which environmental movements have been addressed in social movement studies, but there is a trend of research on what are often called LULUs, so locally unwanted land use. And in fact, they tend to build a different image, also in the north, than the image of the traditional environmental organizations. Because also in the north, I'm thinking about the NOTAV or other type of conflicts, the social base is much more, maybe it's not really environmentalism only of the poor, but it is a much broader local coalitions of different social groups. Plus very different also type of organizations. So the territorial dimension seems to be able to connect environmentalism with other type of topics. It also goes against the image of taming of the environmental movements, because it is the spaces and the places in which actions is more disruptive. So I think that this could also be a useful label to see to which extent, also in the conflicts that you have analyzed, these local dimensions as a specific influence with respect to the traditional studies on institutionalizations, bureaucratizations, and so on of environmental organizations. But I think that then this more institutionalized public interest group of environmentalism sometimes re-enter the pictures, especially in the global south, by supporting some of the conflicts and not others. And thinking about Bob Clifford's work on the selectivity of big NGOs in environmental field in picking and choosing the cases that are supposed to be easier to win or others. And I think this is also an issue that can be interesting. And I think also the territorial dimensions is interesting to reverse the traditional path of environmental thinking globally and act locally, because there it is much more focusing on the local level as a trigger to go up. And in terms of the international dimensions and other questions, observations, I have the impression that the North-South divide that you have addressed all is going to become more and more relevant, also with reference to the questions that were asked in the chat, because not only the asbestos examples that you gave, but also most renewable energies have very high cost in the South, from lithium to others. And I think that this, on the one hand, can create a very strong cleavage within environmental organizations between those who think holistic, to use that, and those instead who think very focused. And maybe movements like Fridays for Future will be quite challenged to address these issues.
Thank you. Yes. Can you? Can you? Yes. Thank you very much. And
Can I just take? Oh, okay. I cannot touch it. Oh my goodness. Oh, thank you for the presentations. I really enjoyed them. I wanted to ask you, as a panel, to reflect a little bit on a potential contradiction that I see in the way of operating of environmental movements. In particular, I was thinking about the first presentation on the self-investigation about the composition of the solidarity networks, and comparing it to the way environmental activism or activism in general works in Italy. This type of investigation is usually not done, at least not systematically. And so I was wondering whether it's a question also sometimes of different protest cultures. I lived many years in the United States, and this question of always investigating who we are, first of all, how we do it, was always at the forefront. And in Italy, it's usually not. And so I was wondering whether these two different modus operandi are compatible, can learn from each other. The reason why in Italy is not is that sometimes it is perceived as paralyzing, right? You start looking at yourself, at your internal composition, and you end up not doing anything on the outside, right? But on the other hand, it's very much needed. So I was wondering whether that is something that can be further investigated and reflected upon. Marco De Seris, I study.
thank you for the questions. I think we can start with the first round of interventions, because there were already a lot of questions. So yes, feel free to start.
How to avoid the constant reappearance of sacrificial areas, and how can people who enjoy greater levels of privilege can contribute to constraining or eliminating that tendency for the emergence of sacrificial areas and sacrificial or sacrificed social groups. I think And okay, for the sake of transparency, I must say that I also lived several years in the United States, and I was also very much influenced not only by its economic culture, but also by its protest culture. I was part of Occupy Wall Street over there. I think that we should begin by trying to deconstruct the way racism somehow penetrates our minds without us even noticing. Through aesthetics, for example, and other ways, to try to really investigate how mechanisms of dehumanization, of making another human being less than human, are symbolically produced and reproduced in our culture and in our everyday life, and trying to understand, even in a kind of psychoanalytical way, how it might actually frame our behaviors, our attitudes, and especially our blind spots. I don't know if this answer is very helpful, but I think that being radically transdisciplinary and daring to go into the field of psychoanalysis and into the field of aesthetics and media studies, and to really research how it's structures our perceptions and attitudes, especially at the unconscious level, as individuals and as a collective, would be extremely useful. I know this sounds very American, but well, there are many good things coming from the United States as well. Not only the tragedies we saw in the past decade. And why this predominance of the middle classes in the global north, in the development of community-led initiatives? One of the questions I'm trying to address in my current research. To be honest, well, this is just a preliminary answer. I kind of believe it might have to do with the kind of capitalist formation that predominates in the global north. The erosion of the material basis for class solidarity and mobilization among workers and peasants. Something that somehow still remains in pockets of the so-called global south. And also because as a result of that erosion of the material basis of class solidarity in the global north, many of the so-called left-wing or progressive ideas end up being produced and reproduced, for example, in academic circles or in certain cultural circles that are somehow, that somehow have a kind of habitus that is more easily identified with that of the middle class. One thing that I've been noticing is that many people from the so-called precariat, from what we used to call in the global north the working class or the peasant class, find a lot of difficulty in identifying themselves with the so-called left or with progressive movements. I've heard many people saying, oh, I don't understand the language sounds so posh. Oh, my main concern is about how to put food on the table for my children or to make sure that they're safe. Why should I care about deconstructing gender or deconstructing race or this or that? My concerns are much more material and are much more in the here and now. And I believe that this kind of contradiction between theory and practice, and the difficulty that especially the intellectual milieu of the left and of progressive circles have in communicating and including people of the former working class and peasant class, contributes to situations like Hillary Clinton some years ago calling those very same people the deplorables. And it also contributes to the growth of the far right and authoritarian populist movements. So there's a lot of soul searching to be done in the near future. Regarding Donatella's question, Donatella, please correct me if I'm wrong. I have the impression that the questions you pose, they all come down to how to bridge master frames, how to bridge the holistic approach and the dialectic approach. Is that what you meant?
Oriented towards the but about how to analyze these things. And my impression is that there is a cleavage and that will be increased in the future between the two types of approaches. And that's also in the analysis of environmental social movement organizations. Usually these territorial conflicts are not taken into account, and this usually means that there is an image of institutionalizations and so on that is built upon the focus on some types of organizations. Because also the middle class side is not something that emerges so strongly in territorial conflicts, where there is an environmentalism of the poor also in.
That's a very good point. I think that in the global north there is a potential for convergence. At least this is my preliminary conclusion. This is my preliminary impression. It might change as we proceed further into our project, especially during fieldwork. But what I notice is that the Global Eco-Village Network, the Transition Network, and REPAS, they're all looking in the same direction. They have similar goals, but they have different bird's eye views. And I think that if we have elements in this movement, especially bridging elements, for example, engaged academics, or others, which can help activists which have other things to do than do research, actually understand this fact, I think that there is a big potential for convergence. And I see it starting to happen. The conference Social and Solidarity and the Commons, which I've been organizing in Lisbon, actually led to a convergence between these three movements. REPAS is actively participating in ECOLIS, which is a kind of umbrella organization that was founded by Jen, by Transition and by Transition Network. And REPAS is now approaching ECOLIS. I don't know if they're going to become a formal member, but at least there's joint work happening. And the fact that these, and the fact that the unintentional reproduction of these inequalities is somehow exploding in their faces is leading to a lot of soul searching, which, if it's steered in a constructive direction, might actually contribute to a greater convergence of frames. Let's keep our fingers crossed. Regarding the Global South, I'm not so optimistic because the class cleavages are much, much greater. The cases that I know better are those of Brazil and Argentina. And I see that there's no overlap in terms of social movement participation between the solidarity economy movement and the eco-villages movement. One thing that I noticed in Brazil is that the eco-villages movement is an exclusive fiefdom of the white upper middle classes, while solidarity economy movement is a kind of regenerative development of the poor. In Europe, especially in Southern Europe, is different. I see many people of a middle class background, but connected to the internationalist left, who are very committed to movements of community-led initiatives, who associate themselves with the solidarity economy movement because of connections with the Global South, especially through the World Social Forum. And they're all very involved with the transition town network or the Global Eco-Village network. Italy is a paradigmatic example. southern France, especially the region of the Midi, you know, around Provence, and so on, especially in the Toulouse and then also in the Bordeaux region, is another case. Because of these intercontinental connections. And I believe that those connections help in the transmission of frames and help to build that bridging in the global south, as inequalities seem to be getting bigger and bigger. I find it much more difficult. Regarding Marco De Seri's question, in terms of the contradiction between self-investigation and actual protest, that's a very good question. It's something also that I'm going to look into. From my still superficial or kind of superficial understanding, I believe that yes, protest cultures really do matter. The Global Eco-Village Network and Transition Network is, like I said, very much embedded in the Northwestern European activist culture, while also with very strong connections to North America. Findhorn and the Esalen Institute in Northern California were created in exactly the same year, and there are many exchanges between Esalen and Findhorn, and between Esalen and Tamara as well, but that's another story. And it's not by chance that the Transition Network was the first one to engage in this kind of self-investigation, and that RIPES is the last. And that RIPES is only starting to do that now in 2021, thanks to Global South engaged academics living in Southern Europe, especially feminist academics, who are doing that kind of criticism and self-investigation from the perspective of gender. Yeah. That's it. I hope this was clear.
Well, I wanted to add that perhaps a good mediation between for me, these two protest cultures are basically the former one that you presented is a Protestant protest culture. You have to investigate yourself like it's a form of subjectivity. And the second one that I was referring to, the Italian one, is a Catholic protest culture. But the feminist movement could be an interesting mediator because of the self-investigation, the positionality, the situated knowledges of all feminist epistemologies start always from where are you coming from, why are you here, what is your contribution, what is this collective doing internally before speaking outside, and so on. So exactly. For me, that's perhaps the way to bridge these two protest cultures passes through the feminist movement.
Exactly. And if you don't mind that I add just a little detail. You talk about Protestant protest cultures. I notice a huge influence of frames like anthroposophy and also the influence of some authors which are kind of connected with certain currents of Western esotericism. Like Grundtvig, for example, who, from what I heard, and please correct me if I'm wrong, was somehow connected with the Rosicrucian movement in Denmark during the 17th century, I think. Thomas, please correct me if I'm wrong. Grundtvig, who had a yes, he was. I read somewhere that he was somehow connected with Rosicrucianism. Yes, so yes, these protest culture comes from a predominantly Protestant area, but there's a big influence of, I don't know if I can call them marginal currents, but more underground currents connected with Western esotericism. And also the cultural influence of Germanic Romanticism. Rudolf Steiner, Grundtvig, a heritage of the Scandinavian romantic nationalism. Many eco-village activists in Scandinavia love Edvard Grieg, for example.
Entrepreneurial spirit, also,
Yes.
not accidentally. The whole Steiner movement, also in Italy, is quite strong, actually. There's so many cooperatives that are following. And if you interview these people, they'll tell you that they're doing a revolution that passes through a certain way of cultivating the land, following a certain philosophy. So they are running their own silent revolution that for them is absolutely connected to the environmental movement.
Educating their children, producing art, a way of dressing as well.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for the questions and comments. Well, regarding Sophia's question, thank you very much. She's not here. Okay. So, yeah, she was also part of the organizers. Yes, but thank you, Sophia, for the question. Very important question regarding the environmental injustice, no, from which we benefit. I think that to answer this question, I will say that there is like an individual, a social and political, and also an academic response, no? First, as individual, I think we should like be aware and really be critical about our consumption patterns. First, is more like individual answer in what are we consuming, where does the food comes from, who are we, or to whom are we paying our or goods or food, for instance. And then there is a social one also. I mean, if we are part of, I have been migrant since I was 20 years old, and I am from Costa Rica, then I went to live in Ecuador, Brazil. And then what I also try to do is to engage in the social protests that are in the neighborhood, no? I mean, it doesn't matter where you come from, but at least where you are living or the neighborhood that you are inhabiting there, what are your political actions that can be done in the place that you are, no? So I think this could be also another answer in how to be or to make visible the environmental injustice from which we benefit without dying and without feeling guilty every day, of course, because we are living in Europe, no? So there are some patterns or some energy consumption that we cannot avoid, and so at least I will also suggest to be critical, but without feeling guilty, no? Because there are so many young people today that they are like changing their consumption patterns, and it's okay, but at the same time, there is some limits in how the actions that we can take. And then I think it's also important to contest, and especially now, before 2 weeks to the COP and all these green discourses, to be also critical about the green discourses that we are facing in the news, also in the academia, no? So to what extent these green discourses or these green decisions that our governments are putting into place have a social or a social inequality component. I will go back again to this part at the end of my answer. But I think this is important. And since we are in academia, I think also the academia is a very important tool. I mean, how do we do research is also very important, how to make this environmental injustice visible, no? Not only about our positionality, but also the methodologies that we use. The critical methodologies that we use, the critical theories that we want to take into place. And I will suggest that also, yes, the university, when we give classes, when we publish, also this is also important, or another important step that we can do as scholars. They would be like for the first question. And I was thinking, and I don't have now the answer for Donatella's question, because what I saw in my research, it was like in the context of pollution, this space-based analysis of environmental justice becomes much more complex. For instance, in the EAGE Atlas, we have a place. You saw like the point, where is this place? There is like a space dimension, and here I would like to define also that space is not the same as territory. No, territory means also the relation that we have with the space, the cultural, the historical relations that we have with that space in particular. And here I would say that the critical geography coming from Brazil and from Latin America has much more to offer to this debate. But what I saw with the EAGE Atlas doing research in environmental conflicts and toxic pollution was that sometimes the conflict or people is protesting against a specific form of pollution that it's located very miles away. So I remember now a project in Peru, the Camisea project, a gas extraction project, and indigenous people living miles away have mercury in their blood, and many children are dying now. And there is they also said the epidemic of this kind of toxic pollution. There have been some tests in the mercury in the hair, in the blood, and everything. But the project is many miles away. So there is a conflict, yes, but it's the effects of this kind of pollution. It doesn't look or is not in the space. So I think I saw that this is why I always repeat myself environmental justice across time and space. No, so in that kind, for me, or what I saw, it was not really space-based, but not only in terms of geographical space, but also across time. And it links also with the other question that you said about the actors, no? That who mobilize. Well, it also was a finding in my thesis that there is much more groups from the working class mobilizing in environmental health conflicts. But why I did not look, because there is more research to do on that. I see who mobilizes, but I don't see their networks. So what I would like to look now is to see, for instance, when artisanal mine is mobilized, who else mobilized? And if they are engaged or putting their political agendas together, no? Because now I remember another case in Colombia, for instance, where mining workers are mobilizing because they want more occupational health laws, but they are not against the project. They only want to have better working conditions, while indigenous people are against the project. They don't want the project there because it's polluting and contaminating their soil. So what is the intersection among these two very different research agenda, very different research group, where you see indigenous people protesting because of the environmentalism of the poor, and the other one coming more from a more working class perspective. So I think this is would be very interesting also to do it with the EAGE Atlas in that regard. And then I also see the division of the global north-south will be much more debated, not only because the energy transition, and also because of the top-down solutions to protect nature that we are seeing now, no? For instance, in 2 weeks in the COP, they will talk about to protect nature and to protect a percentage of nature around the world. But where are these nature or these protected areas will be placed, no? So who is going to pay the cost of conservation? I am indigenous myself. My grandfather was indigenous. And in my family, for instance, they are being part of a restoration forest, that you cannot touch the forest and you are paying, no? Payment for ecosystem services. And for instance, my uncle cannot use the tree that he wanted to use for his house. So this kind of contradictions that you see in some global agendas that are top-down, also I think will need to be more critical. Yes, let's face climate change, but it has to be like a social justice component into it. So, and another part that I wanted to say, it's, and we're talking yesterday about the increasing mining extraction in the ocean, like deep sea mining to extract some of the materials that will be needed for the energy transition. And there, are we going to see conflicts around that? Who will protest? Because it's the ocean, no one lives there. So how, this is also another key component in the energy transition, that a lot of mining projects in the ocean, and that, of course, it's related to environmental justice, not from an anthropogenic perspective, but more than humans environmental justice, no? Because, of course, if there is sea mining, there will be pollution, and it will be many more species that will be affected. So, yes, global north-south, but also the dichotomy among anthropogenic and more than anthropogenic environmental justice. And there has some debates on that, no? More than humans and environmental justice. There are some theoretical efforts in this regard, too. I don't remember the name now, but Gaiman, I think, and other authors. Thank you.
So thank you very much for the questions. I may start with the first one on environmental racism and what we that have been benefiting historically from it can do in our both professional and personal spheres. I strongly believe that we should always work against silencing voices in academia and also in our activism and everyday life. And I think it's important to decolonize academia, decolonize our research methods, to decolonize our also a way of thinking in personal life and see what is behind all this and what is that communities are claiming, our neighbors, and what is that we can do and always work with the communities on the ground, but also supporting, but always working together with them. I think that would be my answer to the first question. And so territorial dimension and big NGOs following. If I understood good, and I will try to answer from my research perspective on the Arctic, I think I could connect the dimension, territorial dimension of the Arctic and looking at the North Pole and how this territory, and the way that people live there for millennia and have been connected to the nature and defend, this territory has been influenced by different nation states and has a history of colonialism. Each part of the Arctic from another state, North Europe, the Russian Federation, Canada, and with legacies from colonialism from Europe. So it's a territory that is protected, and that it's a territory also, what I saw in this conflict, that it's not only saying what is happening here and why are we defending the territory, is the meaning that it has for us. And it's also a territory where identities have been very much built and defended against colonialism. In that sense of territory, if I understood good, yeah. So big NGOs, especially in the Arctic and climate change issues that we have been hearing a lot now in the media. Also, I think it's important, but also what is important is to listen and to work with the communities on the ground when we frame climate change, when we frame what we have to protect, which part of the territory, of the waters, of the seas, and what is important that in this process, supporting environmental protection from big NGOs, let's say, it's important that local customs and local economies are not affected in this regard, because we have to listen to the people that live there and that protect and know the territory very well. And what is important to be sustainable, just, and also moving toward green and more just transitions. No, this is, I think, very important in this sense. And north-south divides. Yeah, I also reflected on this in the research, and I think that, we see that in both global north and global south, there are targeted territories and always historically marginalized and colonial spaces. And what is important to see that this, in the cases of extractive industries, it's always targeting the same places wherever we look at these conflicts. Of course, I think it's important to say that we, in both south and the north, we look into the south in the south and the south in the north. So who is, as Grettel said, affected all the time in both divides, let's say. So, and if I understood good, the question on contradiction and opportunities for mobilizing, if I understood good the question, and we also talked with Grettel, opportunities to mobilize depends a lot as well who has the right and the privilege to mobilize, and after whom we see police coming and sometimes military, let's say, part, and who, when protest, don't have these issues, and also structural violence, colonial relations as well in the, let's say, these opportunities to protest, and this has been seen very much when we look at the criminalization of activists who is suffering these injustices and who has the privilege, to protest. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your answers. We still have about 15 minutes, so we can have another round of questions. Maybe we'll have to be a little bit quicker in the whole round, but yes.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the very informative and elaborated lectures. I think it was very fine. I am not an expert on this area, but I think that many of the discussion that we have is general discussion about how the democratic society are functioning, how the economic system are functioning. So in this respect, I think I can give at least some comments on what you have said. First of all, I will say that you mentioned Denmark a couple of times. Yes, we have a very strong environmental climate movement, but we have a government who didn't dare to do anything. So in this respect, they hope for the future and they hope for the technology, but don't make that many initiatives which can improve the environmental situation for the moment. There are really a schisma between the politicians and most of the grassroots movements in relation to what should be done in this situation. But I want to emphasize some of the points that Anna took up. You talked about solidarity economy. You talked about an alternative to the economic orthodoxy, refining the economic space. And then you also said, as I remember, that we need a just, fair, and inclusive transition. I agree with all these issues, but I think that probably for me, one of the most important, there are two important issues, how to handle the economic situation and how to redistribute our resources. Because concerning the economic situation, I think that we need to realize that economic growth, as we have had it during the last centuries, is not possible anymore. If we continue, then, as I think it was the Prime Minister of Sicily, some of the islands in the Pacific Ocean said, if we continue in the way that we have done during the last centuries, it's death for several nations in the Pacific. And that's very clear that if we have to change the situation, we also have to downgrade the growth. But then comes the other problem for me, is a redistribution of the resources that we have for the moment. If we stop growing in economic terms, then we also have to redistribute fundamentally, both internal in the countries, and that's what you are talking about, that there are environmental racism, environmental inequality, but also between the North and South in much more fundamental aspects than we have done so far. And I think that probably, and that's all of you have discussed, the local initiatives, the local bottom-up organizations of the society, that's probably some of the things we have to face much more on than we have done so far. And here, I think it's very important your analysis of environmental injustice and the environmental cases. All, I think, and that's my probably my lack of knowledge, all these cases are more or less dependent on that we want to grow economically. That means we want to have oil, we want to have minerals. In Greenland, there are huge discussion because there seems to be, below the ice, a lot of important minerals. But the Greenland government are very reluctant because they realize if they open up, then they spoil the society completely in this respect. So maybe we have to discuss alternatives to economic system, and here I would have said the alternative to capitalism, but when we talk about the growth, it's just the same procedure which going on in China, Russia, and all the other non-capitalist, at least in official and non-capitalist countries. They all aim for growth, and that's probably our main issues, together with what we are doing here, emphasizing the different kinds of environmental injustice which can't be going on for a long time. Okay, thank you very much for a longer intervention.
A lot. I have a couple of questions. Then have the chance to discuss everything in detail, but it is also the afternoon session. I come at this from a different point of view, which is the one of a researcher on social movements. I've been working on climate mobilization in Italy for the last 3 years now. At this level of climate justice, obviously we treat it as a strategic frame put in place by the movement itself and by many actors within it, in order to make sense also of some internal differences and of some strategic perspectives. And from our analysis, it is also really clear, okay, that this label of climate justice has been used to bring within the movement certain social concerns, certain approaches that connect socioeconomic issues with environmentalism, everything that has been discussed also this morning. But it's also clear that it works more or less as an empty signifier, in the sense that there are also divisions within the movement that all of which appropriate this level of climate justice, because obviously it is broad enough, okay, to serve different political strategies. And my question is, do we think that it needs to be studied only as a strategic frame put in place by different actors, or does it have a heuristic value in se? Do we think that, because obviously, you know, we treat scientific concepts and strategic frames in different ways in our research. And so I wanted to have your take on this, because from the point of view of my analysis, it makes sense only insofar as it is addressed as a strategic frame, while when we have to use our own concept, we obviously need to qualify it, okay, and to look within it, to look with, not to treat it as a black box, okay, and to look at the different meanings that are attached to it. And the second point I wanted to raise has to do with the relationship with science, in the sense that we're witnessing very different processes taking place at the same time in different strands of the climate justice movement and of environmentalism in general. In our research on climate mobilization, especially the protest surveys, show an almost faith-like, okay, blind belief in science, okay, which is then problematized, obviously, in the qualitative component of our research by many, more established activists and so on. But in individual participants, okay, there is this strong faith in science. While on the other hand, and on this I do not have research data, but only anecdotal experience, it's really clear to me that in many subculture of environmentalism, I'm talking about eco-villages, I'm talking about agroecology, I'm talking many subcultures within the environmentalist world, they have been working as channels for the spread, for example, of vaccine skepticism. Okay, it is anecdotal experience, but in my, friend circles, this is huge. Okay, so this double relationship with science, I think it is something that needs to be addressed, and I wanted to know what you think about that.
We are running a little bit late. I was wondering if it's okay for everyone if we take 10 minutes more and we end 10 minutes later. Okay, then there is an answer by question by Donatello.
Just two very short points, thinking about the atlas especially, because I think that one element that I found extremely interesting in your group when I visited you in Barcelona is the interdisciplinarity. And you mentioned geography. Jean is an economist, and there are these different perspectives. And I think this is also an important element, bringing in the different disciplines, maybe also to address questions like Lorenzo's questions about science and so on. And I think that also you as a group have been very skilled in developing ways to look at the different aspects of this atlas, so these cases, not doing only statistical analysis, but also going more in depth. And one element that I think could be added is the more political dimension. You mentioned now the authoritarianism, but I think that even within similar types of regimes, there could be different, for instance, outcomes. That is also an element that you are looking at, that could be explained by the characteristic of the political system, of the political alliances, and so on. The very final things that may also innovate on the use of the atlas. I don't know if some of you has already done it, but it is to introduce in the analysis also negative cases, so cases of non-conflict that of course you don't have in the atlas, but would be interesting in order to understand the conditions for a conflict to emerge, to have similar cases of exploitations of the environment and comparing with those that you have instead included.
There aren't any other questions we can...
Okay. My response concerns all the questions that have been placed in this round, and also a little bit what Marco De Seris referred to in his intervention when he was talking about a culture of entrepreneurship that kind of predominates within, for example, anthroposophical cultures, and also the transition. That's one of the reasons why I'm very much an advocate of agent-centric research and of doing in-depth interviews with movement entrepreneurs that takes into account their biography, that takes into account their positioning diachronically to understand where they come from, what their motivations are, how their life history somehow influences their choices. That might help explain, for example, what Lorenzo Zamponi was saying about eco-villages being hubs of diffusion of anti-vax frames, which unfortunately is true in many cases. One of the things I have noticed is that there's a significant cohort within eco-villages that is constituted by people who somehow have bad memories of the school system. People who are or even if they don't have bad memories of the school system, they are extremely critical of mass education. They see it implemented, forcing children to sit for 8 hours straight. They see it as authoritarian. They see it as imposing. They see it as disrespectful of local cultural specificities. They see it as imposing frames of thought on children's minds that aim mainly to produce docile citizens and docile workers instead of, balanced human beings. And I have the impression that this critical perspective of mass education, especially public education, might explain some of these some of these frames which are critical of mainstream science and which are critical of vaccination efforts, for example, might explain why so many of these people feel inclined towards so-called alternative medicine, homeopathy, anthroposophical medicine, and so on. And that's why and why are they inclined towards these frames? That's why I think it's important not only to understand their own individual biography, but also how they are positioned within the global political economy. How they are positioned within structural power relations that go even beyond the borders of their own national political economy. How they are positioned in the class structure of their own country, and how their own country is positioned within the world system, what Wallerstein would call the world system. I think that this helps explain certain movement cultures, certain protest cultures. For example, what Thomas was saying, the fact that in Denmark you have a very strong environmental movement, but the government does very little or nothing at all. My theory, and this is something I would like to test during fieldwork, because part of the fieldwork of the project that I'm currently coordinating will very probably take place in Sweden and Denmark, is that historically the Scandinavian welfare state took care of a lot of material needs. But the environmental question has been put a little bit aside, because the welfare state, the social democratic welfare state, coexists with corporate capitalism. One of the things that I would like to test, actually to explain why the so-called holistic master frame is so predominant in Northern Europe, while the solidarity economy narrative and the dialectic master frame of regenerative development hasn't really taken off, despite the fact that activists over there are also very well connected with the Global South. One of the theories I have, that it has to do with the coexistence of the welfare state, and then, the bureaucratization and the influence of technocratic criteria within the welfare state as a result of globalization, which made people think more about community as a way of having more humane services, and as a way also of rebuilding human connections. But from a very ecocentric perspective, because of cultural reasons, because the way in which these activists are located within their standpoint within the national and global political economy made them interpret also certain cultural frames, Grundtvigs ideas, romanticism and so on, in a certain way. I hope this makes sense, what I'm saying. I'm still playing with these ideas. So it's a kind of political economy perspective on the standpoint of movement entrepreneurs, which contributes to the way in which they interpret frames. I hope this is a satisfactory answer. I'm going to talk about it more in depth during my talk on the 5th. I hope you'll all be able to attend physically or virtually.
Margarita, Grettel?
Thank you. Yes, we forgot in our presentations to explain better why conflicts occur, no? And there is the hypothesis, as you mentioned, there is an economic answer of that, and is the theory of social metabolism that we did not address, but that we have the opportunity to address it now, which is like the increasing use of energy and materials will lead to more environmental conflicts. And this is exactly what we see in the EAGE Atlas. As Ksenija's work mentioned, it is the increasing commodity frontiers every time companies going further and further to extract energy and to extract materials, and this is why people who are in these places protest and react against and protest. So there is this economic hypothesis behind the IJATLAS that comes from the ecological economics and the link with the environmental justice perspective. Then what we need to take care about, and is very linked with what you mentioned, is that now I think, as I see, is like an epistemic struggle between environmentalists. As I said, I think we need to take care about the green solutions and all these climate change discourses that do not contest the economic system in which we are. Because I've been following some news about the COP, and I see it's very discouraging in how they are putting into place green solutions to climate change, but at the same time we see they are reproducing the same system. They are not contesting economic growth, which is, of course, the main problem of the climate crisis, and they are not taking into account the social justice perspective. So right now, as I see, is that some environmental discourses are being co-opted, and we as scholars, we need to face that, and we need to keep struggling against. We are talking about the same, but there are different drivers behind that. So I wanted also to say that, I think there is a long epistemic struggle, but even more now, as we see companies, we see Jeff Bezos giving money to protect the earth, we see Google, and we see, for instance, mining companies doing green mining. So what does that mean? So I think there is a fight there, there is a political struggle there, I think that the case of science, of course, is very complex. What I can say from the conflicts, environmental health conflicts that I have studied, is that, and here I will say a case about the glyphosate in Argentina. There was one doctor saying the glyphosate is not producing cancer, and the other doctor saying the glyphosate can produce cancer. So we have two different doctors from very well-known university saying completely the opposite. How do people and how in the communities, they face science in the both sides? Now we have to ask who is paying your research, of course, who is behind this hypothesis or these conclusions. What I found interesting in the case of Argentina is how the people mobilize with their own tools to make them their maps, and using some tools of popular epidemiology that was defined by Phil Brown, with all these community-based forms of knowledge. So in that case, I think they have much more to offer. But at the end, to claim for political action, they need the evidence. This is the thing, So they need engaged scientists to back up their findings, to ask for political action, which at the end is the main goal for these communities, not to ban the glyphosate and to ban all these agriculture-based pesticides that it's making them ill. About the vaccine, I have not talked about it, but yes, I think it's a very complex issue and interesting to look at. I don't have the answer, and yeah. Maybe Ksenija have more to add in this regard. And then, Donatella, thank you, or not. It's okay. But, and thank you also for all the advices that you are giving us. The Atlas, I think we ourselves, we have this global database that we are starting to explore more in deep. And of course, that your advices are very, very welcome. What we have in the Atlas is a variable that says latent conflict. That it's like when people is not mobilizing or is not mobilizing yet. But yes, we don't map non-conflicts. I think now I was thinking about the work of Ana Laura Wainwright in China about resign activism, How do people do not protest because of the conditions, of course, they have in China. But I see, what I can say in that regard is, for instance, as I said, I am from Costa Rica, and Central America is a very small region, but at the same time, they have very different political regimes. Now we have Costa Rica, which is by excellence the model of democracy, but at the same time, we have Nicaragua as a neighbor, we have Guatemala. And what I see in this very small region is how the violence is differently different use against environmental defenders. So we see Honduras is the case in which more environmental defenders are being killed, while Costa Rica, there are not too many. So I think this has to see with the history about the political regimes, of course, and how conflicts are also institutionalized. No, for instance, in one cases, people use mainly direct actions, while in Costa Rica they mostly use institutionalized tools to take care of the conflict. So I think that advice you gave me can help me also to look at one specific region, but very different regions. Yes, thank you for that.
Okay, thank you for the questions. To start with the economy growth, and now that we hear about this just transition, and I also can reflect on Greenland, that I have been looking at it, no? And just 2 days ago, I saw another seabed mining proposed by a diamond giant, saying that it will boost the economy, and it will be based on very green and secure, carbon neutral extraction. No, in Greenland. At the same time, so they promote extraction still, but putting these names and green discourses behind, when we don't know so much how it will help the economy first. And secondly, we don't know anything about these new seabed mining technologies, or what consequences it has on the oceans. So it is also at the same time what we addressed in the Arctic paper, to see how changes in government can or cannot approve a project. So in the case of Greenland, this has been recently very much debated in the public spheres, how government is rethinking of not to use the country for oil exploration, and thinking about the ban, as well as the ban on uranium mining in the region. So as long as we call for economic growth and just transition, we have to look at environmental justices, at the whole process of these activities, as we also saw in supply chain of nuclear conflicts. And also what has been argued very much by scientists is that seabed mining could have consequences in 20 years. And it will be affected again traditional coastal communities and fisher people. It won't maybe appear in 2 years or at the same time while the mining starts. So we have to keep that in mind as well in this green discourse and transitions and new technologies. Thank you. And if I understand good your question on how to study social movements and how we see conflicts and environmental justice movements, and how this is related to science, and as Donatella said later on, highly inter and transdisciplinary research to understand all these processes and looking into whole dimension. We also see environmental conflict as a process. It has its, let's say, beginning, the development, and also the end, which is not always successful, of course. And we at the Atlas, we highly engage with economic theories, social movements theories, environmental justice. It's highly inter and transdisciplinary project, and we keep that also when we write and publish try to publish our work, and we engage a lot with multiple theories, which at the same time we believe strongly that it's necessary to address all these issues, but at the same time challenging. But we look forward to break with these challenges and continue doing our work at looking at all these processes, and dimensions of environmental justice. And for example, in the what is a success, how a project or protesting against environmental injustices depends on the regimes. We saw it also in my research, in particular with the nuclear cases, that we were surprised that we found that there was so much resistance at that time. That was very difficult, and that it put a ban on almost global level on nuclear weapon tests. So there are successful cases in that sense, but also in the Arctic paper we look at rule of law index. Which has, sorry, I had to look a little bit on it. So it looks on government powers, absence of corruption, open government, fundamental rights, civil justice, and criminal justice index. And we saw that protesting and putting an end of a project that is highly protested depends on highly on the governments, and the regimes, especially when looking at the Nordic countries and the Russian Federation, there is a huge difference. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So we'll now have a lunch pause until 3. And then in the afternoon, we'll have only an in-person session that will be both dedicated to have a practical presentation of the HIE Atlas as a tool, and also kind of an informal conversation, also to address some of the issues of how to the two scholarships of social movements and environmental justice can intersect productively. Thanks again to our speakers for the amazing presentations and contributions.